Canada's booze ban is hitting American makers hard and fast. According to the Wall Street Journal, Canadian provinces have stopped ordering U.S.-made spirits, wine, and beer after a trade battle sparked earlier this year by President Trump's tariffs.
We have pallets of product that was bottled and designated for Canada that are sitting in our warehouse.
Inside the LCBO, the American whiskeys, the Kentucky bourbons that Premier Doug Ford has really honed in on, California wines, any U.S. ready-to-drink cocktails gone from the shelves. That's 3,600 products from 35 U.S. states no longer available.
Hey, welcome back to the channel. There's something happening right now that almost no one saw coming. A silent collapse that started in liquor stores, not boardrooms. In just one quarter, U.S. spirit exports to Canada plunged 85%, dropping below $10 million, the lowest level in modern trade history between the two countries. Shelves that once carried Jack Daniel's and Jim Beam are suddenly empty or replaced with Canadian brands. Across the provinces, retail sales of American liquors fell over 66% in just 8 weeks. Ontario, Canada's biggest alcohol market, saw bourbon and whiskey sales crash by 80% in April and May. Even other categories weren't spared. Vodka down 14%, whiskey 13%, brandy 12%. Analysts are calling it a new kind of prohibition. But this time, it's not law enforcement pulling bottles off the shelf. It's consumers. Ordinary Canadians making an extraordinary statement. So what exactly caused one of the closest trade relationships in the world to unravel and turn a glass of whiskey into a symbol of defiance? Stick around, because this story goes far beyond alcohol. Before we begin, hit that like button if you're finding this eye-opening. It really helps us beat the algorithm. But this collapse didn't just happen out of nowhere. It started with a sentence, a single remark that turned from a headline into a national flashpoint. On September 30th, 2025, during a closed-door meeting with U.S. military officials, Donald Trump repeated a phrase he'd used years before. Canada should be the 51st state of America. What might have sounded like a joke in Washington landed like an insult in Ottawa. Just days earlier, in a meeting with Prime Minister Mark Carney, Trump reportedly said there was a natural conflict between the two nations, but that Canada would walk away very happy. The reaction north of the border was immediate. Within 72 hours, clips of the remark went viral on Canadian social media, gathering over 8 million shares and sparking the hashtag #BuyCanadianOnly. Politicians from across party lines, liberals, conservatives, even independents, publicly condemned the statement as a blow to economic sovereignty. In a country where trade has always been tied to identity, those few words were enough to set off a domino effect. American products, once symbols of shared prosperity, suddenly became emblems of condescension. And the first casualty was the drink that had long connected the two sides of the border, American whiskey. If you've made it this far, you probably care. Consider subscribing to stay updated. That outrage didn't stay online for long. It moved into policy. What began as a wave of consumer frustration quickly turned into a coordinated economic stance across Canada's provinces. Within weeks, provincial governments were no longer just watching the boycott, they were enforcing it. Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick instructed their publicly owned liquor corporations, LCBO and SAQ, to pull American products from store shelves. For many consumers, it wasn't just about avoiding U.S. brands anymore. It became a question of principle, broadcast through official channels. Even as Ottawa quietly lifted its retaliatory tariffs that September, the provinces held their ground. Officials described the continued restrictions not as trade measures, but as a response to disrespect. Only Alberta and Saskatchewan refused to join, allowing American imports to continue, and immediately faced criticism for showing a lack of national unity. Across the hospitality sector, the movement spread on its own. Bars and restaurants voluntarily removed Jack Daniel's and Jim Beam from their menus, enduring up to 40% revenue losses in just 3 months. In Quebec, major supermarket chains swapped American whiskey for homegrown brands like Crown Royal and 40 Creek, calling it an act of economic patriotism. By late spring, what started as a viral slogan had become something larger, a system-wide stance that blurred the line between consumer choice and provincial policy. But irony has a way of finding its moment. Just as Canadian consumers were rallying behind local brands, one of the country's most iconic names, Crown Royal, found itself at the center of a very different storm. In February 2026, Diageo, Crown Royal's parent company, announced it would shut down its bottling plant in Amherstburg, Ontario, cutting nearly 200 unionized jobs. What was supposed to be a corporate restructuring quickly turned into a political flashpoint. Ontario Premier Doug Ford made headlines when he poured out a bottle of Crown Royal on camera, declaring, "This is what I think of betrayal." The Ontario government warned the move could threaten CAD $740 million in annual revenue tied to provincial contracts with Diageo, while labor union Unifor accused the company of bowing to political pressure from Washington, suggesting that Trump's push for Made in America production had quietly reached north of the border. Public anger followed fast. Across Ontario and Quebec, calls grew to remove all Diageo products, from Johnnie Walker to Guinness, from provincial shelves. The company, once seen as a symbol of Canadian craftsmanship, was suddenly portrayed as a brand that had walked away from its roots. In a twist few predicted, the very brand that benefited most from the U.S. boycott became the next target of Canada's own wave of economic nationalism. Proof that in a trade war built on pride, no one stays untouchable for long. By this point, both sides had made their stand. Each spoke of defending economic sovereignty, yet both were quietly bleeding from the same wound. In the first half of 2025, U.S. spirit exports to Canada fell 62%, inflicting direct losses on distillers across Kentucky and Tennessee, the heartlands of American whiskey. In Kentucky alone, which produces over 95% of the world's bourbon, thousands of barrels now sit unsold in warehouses, threatening jobs across nearly 50 distilleries. Industry giant Brown-Forman, the maker of Jack Daniel's, reported its Canadian sales down nearly 60%, forcing the company to cut back production for the first time in years. Analysts warned that the ripple effects could soon hit U.S. grain suppliers, truckers, and even packaging plants tied to the whiskey supply chain. But Canada wasn't unscathed either. The decision by Diageo to move operations south left a vacuum. 500 Canadian workers in bottling, transport, and logistics now face uncertainty. Local governments are also bracing for lost tax revenue and declining export activity from what was once a flagship industry. Trade experts describe the standoff as a symbolic war with no winner. Both countries sought to assert independence, yet ended up demonstrating how intertwined and vulnerable their economies truly are. What began as a small trade spat over liquor is now testing the foundation of U.S.-Canada economic ties. The whiskey boycott, once dismissed as a short-lived protest, has become a case study in how public sentiment can reshape trade faster than any tariff. Anxiety is spreading across industries, from Midwestern soybean farmers to auto plants in Michigan, all fearing a chain reaction boycott among Canadian consumers. Trade groups warn that the cross-border trust sustaining $900 billion in annual commerce is quietly eroding, replaced by skepticism toward anything marked Made in USA. Border states like Michigan and New York are urging Washington to cool tensions, while European brands such as Jameson and Glenfiddich rush to fill the empty shelves, boosting their Canadian sales by 40%. This isn't just a temporary slump, it's a strategic shift in consumer behavior that could reshape Canada's market for years and remind both nations how fragile economic goodwill can be. In the end, this story isn't just about whiskey. It's about identity, power, and the price of pride. Both nations insist they're standing up for their principles. Canada says it won't bow to political pressure, while the U.S. champions a patriotic production model meant to bring jobs back home. But beneath those slogans, the economic fallout tells another story, one where both sides lose something they can't easily replace. Canadian firms are facing layoffs, shrinking contracts, and the risk of long-term brand damage. American distillers, once confident in their northern market, are watching their most stable export channel collapse. Trade analysts now estimate that if anti-U.S. sentiment persists, American spirit exports to Canada could fall below 25% of pre-pandemic levels, leaving the industry permanently reshaped. And beyond the bottles and bar counters, a bigger concern is emerging: the erosion of the open border model that has defined North American cooperation for decades. What happens to that model when emotion, not economics, begins to drive policy and consumption? So maybe the real question isn't who wins this trade dispute, but whether a single glass of whiskey can become a test of North America's future under the USMCA. Trade wars often start with policies, but they endure through perception. Once trust breaks, even allies start to look at each other through the lens of rivalry. The rift between the US and Canada over something as ordinary as alcohol may fade with time, or it may mark the beginning of a deeper realignment in how both countries see their place in the region. So, what do you think? Is this a momentary flare-up, or are we watching the early signs of a lasting economic divide between neighbors? If this video gave you something to think about, like and subscribe to support more content like this. Thank you.